to all students and members of the CS fraternity who have joined the webinar today from parts of the world. I'm Inderpreet Kaur, Associate Member of ICSI India and Chairperson of ICSI Overseas Centre UK. We as the Overseas Centre are extremely grateful and thankful to ICSI for taking the necessary steps of bringing the global CS community together and setting up the UK Centre. Today, the Overseas Centre is delighted to present our first webinar on a very conventional, yet one of the most important aspects of the CS profession. We have a management professional from UK, Ms. Erika Percival, as our guest speaker today, who will be sharing insights into the importance of minutes from a very interesting angle today. Let's make the most of it, and we hope the session will be extremely informative for all of you. I would now hand over to Soumya Rastogi, who will be the moderator of the session for today's session.
Thank you, Inderpreet. Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Soumya Rastogi, an associate member of ICSI, ICSI UK, member and secretary of ICSI Overseas Centre UK, and the moderator for today's webinar. 2020 has clearly been a roller coaster for all of us, and we would remember this year for all of these reasons. But I would like to thank ICSI Centre for taking this initiative in middle of COVID pandemic and launching ICSI Overseas Centre in the UK. And I'm glad to be a part of this initiative. I'm delighted to present our first webinar, and topic for today's session is one which we all are very familiar with. It's minutes. But I would like to raise a question to you all. Are your minutes the company's best insurance policy or its greatest risk? You may find minutes a very general topic. If you ask me, I would say, yes, me too. This is probably because we have known and had been learning about minutes since our student days and putting them into practice until now. We all have studied about minutes writing, its importance, and underlying statutory provisions in CS modules, had gained practical knowledge in our management training days, and I reckon as we move ahead in our career, minutes would still stick around whether we like it or not. But have you ever thought upon questions like why so much importance is given to minutes, not only in India, but globally? How minutes could work as a get out of jail free card for directors and could be your best insurance policy, or it can be your greatest weakness. Let's find out answers to these questions in our today's webinar, and the right approach we should adopt to ensure is best corporate governance. Also in today's webinar, we would touch base upon how COVID-19 has impacted our current ways of conducting board and shareholders meetings, and tips for some effective minutes writing. Now may I please introduce our guest speaker, Ms. Erika Percival. Erika is CEO of Beyond Governance, a UK Indian governance and a company secretary. Beyond Governance is a company secretarial consultancy that takes a fresh approach to good governance and brings fantastic benefits to small business up to listed multinationals. Erika founded the consultancy and is one of the UK youngest FTSE 250 group company secretary at an age of 32. That's commendable. Previously, a 2 times group company secretary of London Stock Exchange listed companies, she understands how to implement good corporate governance and that there is no one-size-fits-all solution, and that's a holistic approach to a key success. She spends her career working in-house for companies such as Intercontinental Hotels Group, ICAP, KPMG, and some renowned British European brands such as Restaurant Group PLC, Premier Foods, Low and Bonar PLC. Over the year, Erika has seen many different minute writing styles and has witnessed first-hand opportunities and risk associated with board and committee minutes. Before I hand over to our guest speaker, I hope this webinar provides some interesting insights to our students, aspiring company secretaries, and current members. If you have any questions during the webinar, please drop your questions in the chat box and we will try to answer most of them in the end. If we could not address your questions today, please do not be disappointed and kindly drop us an email at ukcenter@icsi.edu and we will revert shortly. I would now like Erika to take over this session and share her thoughts with us. Erika?
Great, thank you very much, Soumya. So let's get the slides up. Perfect. Ooh. Okay, so board minutes, love them or hate them, they are a fundamental element of good governance for an organisation, and drafting them is the key role of the company secretary. Their importance is often downplayed by company secretaries, governance professionals and directors alike as pure administration. But I think that we should take some time to consider if this is the right approach. I believe that minutes are a company's best insurance policy, and they can be the greatest weakness of a company. So this is our topic for today, as Soumya's helpfully introduced. So we're going to be going through the importance of minuting from a UK perspective, and then looking at what good minutes actually look like and how to get it right. So kicking off, on the screen are a number of reasons why minutes are important, and just to run through those very quickly because you probably understand quite a lot of the rationale behind these. So they enable directors to show that they've discharged their director's duties. If there's a lawsuit, the minutes are used to defend the director's actions. They're the only true legal record of what happened. So they're evidence. They are potentially, as Soumya said, the director's get out of jail free card. They are the cheapest form of insurance for a company, and they can be relied upon in legal disputes. For shareholders and investors, if they require rationale for why decisions were taken, the minutes will be referred back to, so it's important that they're correct. And likewise for owner directors, it can be a real support for their future return on investment to be able to explain in the minutes when they're passed over to a potential purchaser what exactly was happened and why. Director owners can also sometimes think that minutes over and above the annual accounts signing are a bit excessive. And the reason that they think that is probably because they don't understand that a company has a separate legal personality, as we all know. And that separate legal personality means that the board minutes are the only real evidence of the actions that the company took and the reasons why. So coming on to future directors and company secretaries, for larger organisations, looking back at historic board minutes and reviewing them can be really important for future board members at induction, but also just generally for strategic meetings, for executive director performance review appraisals, but also to understand how certain decisions were taken. I'm sure those of you that have worked in larger organisations at senior levels will have experienced coming up against transactions and being frustrated that the minutes, when you look back, are maybe too brief, or they don't really explain certain areas that the directors believe happened, but actually they were never documented. And unfortunately, if it wasn't documented, it didn't legally take place. Coming on to ESG. So for companies in the UK, ESG is becoming an increasingly important factor when it comes to investment perspectives. And the easiest way to evidence the G in the ESG, or the governance factor, is by having great minutes. I think it's our duty as company secretaries to advocate to our boards that reviewing the minutes is really important, and to look at them from an independent perspective to ensure that everything is captured. So coming on to the minutes. So how are the minutes viewed in the UK? So in the UK, minutes are often seen as a purely administrative task. And there's even the title of minutes secretary as a job role or an allocation to someone, which basically is a descriptor for someone whose sole job it is to write minutes in the meeting. But those people are not expected to get involved in the governance and the legal aspects of the company secretarial role. So it's more of a junior role. It's something that even an administrator or a PA might take up, which, whilst they may be very good at drafting good minutes, they don't necessarily have the knowledge of the law and the regulation that we have as company secretaries, and therefore they might not understand what needs to be covered. Fortunately, I have not seen PLC boards and committee meetings being minuted in this way by very junior members of staff. However, I have a number of times been asked by CEOs and CFOs whether this approach was possible, and obviously the answer is categorically no. So many directors, as I've just explained, feel that the minutes are a purely administrative task as well, and they think that a quick skim read through, making sure they sound about right, is all that's needed in a board meeting. But I don't personally agree. I think that the minutes should never be a box ticking exercise. It's vital that the directors consider how they could be construed in hindsight and by someone who wasn't in the meeting. And it's often more about what wasn't put in the minutes than what was covered. And sometimes reading the minutes cold allows you to look at these in a different perspective and to be able to work out what wasn't minuted and discussed and what should be included. And also in the UK, for those of us that work in UK regulated financial services companies, we have an additional level of scrutiny. So we can have the minutes of all board meetings scrutinised by our external regulator. So that is also a clear consideration when we are drafting.
Yeah, thanks, Erika. In the UK, I've seen this one thing. Minutes taking is mostly done in-house as board deals with very confidential and sensitive information. This is, I think, like a very traditional and common thinking. However, in the UK, I've seen many companies outsourcing minutes taking job to CS professionals in practice who are probably experts and the best in this field. I'm sure in India also many broad-minded companies may have started outsourcing this. So, like, what do you think? How safe is this approach? And what risks do you see here? And how these risks can be mitigated?
Yes, so you're right, Soumya. Outsourcing board support, including minute writing, is something that we've seen an increase in at Beyond Governance too. So I think that the reason behind that is because it's a very time-consuming process. It's a very discrete area of governance, and it's also relatively straightforward to separate this work off from the rest of the company secretarial work. So as far as concerns about risk, I think that if you choose a quality firm, I don't think there's any issue. Confidentiality is obviously written into the agreement that you have with them. And to be fair, the risks associated with circulating documents to a professional firm who sits outside of the organisation is no different to those risks that are already associated with external non-executive directors. I think that emails need to be secure and documents need to be password protected, and those passwords need to be shared with the people that are receiving those documents by separate means than email, so maybe a text message or a phone call. If you take Beyond Governance, for example, we carry out work for unlisted and listed companies and clients with regards to minute taking, and they really benefit from having an independent person who isn't affected by the internal politics of business. They also are able to benefit from the knowledge that we have across multiple different companies. And we also don't necessarily have the same level of knowledge as a CS that was based in the company. However, that can be an advantage because it then means that we can ask the silly questions that the non-exec directors are too scared to ask because they don't understand what exactly is going on in the meeting, or we can be the ones that go, could you just explain that for me a little bit more, or is this what you meant, or to summarize. So that can be really helpful. It's also helpful if there are some really tough decisions that are taking place in the meeting to be able to apologies. It's also helpful to be able to come at it from a very independent perspective when it comes to tough decisions. So there may be decisions in that meeting that take place that mean that if it was an internal person, they might otherwise be disengaged or thinking about what impact that might have on their job, or even the people that they know and like within the firm. Now, that obviously doesn't happen when you have someone independent. It also tends to have more success with getting change through in the board. So we are able to advise the board from an external perspective And I know personally that it's really frustrating when external people come in and they tell something that you would have said yourself a couple of weeks before when they didn't listen to you, but somebody else says it who's external, and all of a sudden they listen and go, that's a great idea. We've been there. We are at Beyond Governance, all ex deputy and group company secretaries. So we've worked in-house and we know what that feels like. And it's now, I think, our opportunity as being in private practice to advocate for those company secretarial teams, to be able to bring them in and to be able to raise their profile as part of what we do. And as JF Kennedy said, a rising tide lifts all boats. And I think that that's very true of company secretaries in this situation, because I think that company secretaries need to support each other, whether they're working in-house or in private practice. And when we are all working together, then we can raise the profile of our industry and grow its stature and its prominence.
Yeah, I think, yes, I completely agree. And I think this could be a great piece of advice for company secretaries in practice who could add both support as a new line of service to their current business, and probably for CS in employment looking for outsourcing minutes work. So, yeah. I had like one more question to ask here today. And like we all know, minutes are true record of the meeting and an admissible evidence in the courts. Is that the case in the UK? Is there any live example probably that you could share with us today where, let's say, failure to produce or maybe maintain minutes book properly has caused a legal trouble to the directors?
Yes. So there was a lawsuit that was brought in August this year by HMRC against General Electric, or GE. And that was in relation, for those of you who don't know, in relation to HMRC, they are the tax authority in the United Kingdom, and they are pursuing a $1 billion lawsuit against General Electric. They are claiming that GE made fraudulent misrepresentations of a major transaction to evade UK tax, and allegedly GE failed to provide them with a full set of crucial board minutes. It will be really interesting to see how this plays out, and it serves as a reminder to all of us that the board minutes are really important, and it also goes to show that the company secretarial role is equally very important, and in particular that we should be ensuring that the directors scrutinise the minutes.
Yeah, I think that, so like, how do you get it right? Like, what is the procedure or probably the steps involved in documenting a minute correctly?
Yeah, okay, so moving on then to the minutes. Mastering minute taking is more of an art than a science, but there are legalities to consider too. It's important that you're not just recording a complete and accurate note of the meeting. Good minute taking also is a result of clear planning, be that agendas and board packs, but also being selective with what is recorded and implementing a strategy to be able to get the resulting information out to the board so that they also can approve that. I see agendas and minutes as bookends of the meeting. So one is purely reliant on the other. And both of them need to be equally strong for the meeting itself to be effective. So looking at agendas first, it all starts with a good agenda. The agenda should reflect the company's agreed board meeting objectives. They should cite the specific issues it needs to discuss and cross-reference the board meeting documents, all while being relatively brief. The agenda should be a guidebook to help the directors to navigate the meeting productively and efficiently. And that's why it's vital that when we're drafting, input is sought from the executive directors first when drafting the agendas, and thereafter the chairman, to make sure that all the right points are included before it is then distributed to the full board. So the ordering of the agenda is sometimes something that the company secretary can have some control over, and it's our job to ensure that the right topics are raised in the meeting when the directors have their full concentration. It's unlikely the directors will have full concentration for the entire meeting, and therefore it's important to focus that agenda around those particular points and bring in breaks from the agenda as necessary. So when reviewing the agenda, I always focus on what's working and what isn't working. And you can take that from your previous meeting. And you can identify that everybody was lagging a little bit in the back end of a meeting, and you may need to add another break in, or perhaps change the order of what you talk about when. And I think that that's a really good way of ensuring that the meetings are always as effective as possible. By way of example, I have in some meetings moved the approval of the minutes to the end of the meeting, and that's not to sideline them or to think that they are any less important, but it's to enable the board early on to debate when they have that real concentration, and then at the end to be more reflective. If you don't already have an annual agenda planning schedule, that's really helpful, and planning meetings with the chairman is also really useful. The planning schedule will summarise what needs to be discussed in every meeting throughout the year, and you can plan that at the beginning of the year, share it with the chairman and talk about what the events might look like. You can then obviously prepare the presenters to make sure that you have them ready and available at the times that are going to be important throughout the year. So it saves you time, it saves the directors time, but I think it's really important to remember that that sort of a schedule should never replace a real-time review and meeting with the board, in particular the chairman, to make sure that the agendas are set as they should be for that particular meeting, because things change and it's really important to be able to pivot. So moving on to board packs, it's another key area. So to be able to draft good meeting minutes, the directors must have access to high quality board papers and information, or a board pack, and they must have it in good time. Otherwise, you can't facilitate a good discussion and debate. So working in London Stock Exchange FTSE listed companies, it's bordering on a disciplinary offence to not send out the board packs at least a week in advance, unless it's an emergency meeting or there's something else that really does need to be handled before that. But outside the FTSE 100 or the top 350 companies that are listed on the London Stock Exchange, then I would say that the circulation a week in advance is not quite as rigorous, but it's definitely something that needs to be improved. Sometimes we forget that the investors and the non-executive directors, they often sit on multiple boards and they have other pressures on their time, and they attend those meetings because the company needs them there. They provide important independent perspectives, thought and judgment, and we need to give them time to digest that content. We need them to understand the story of the board pack. So what has happened since the last board meeting? And we need them to be able to formulate questions. So the worst I've seen are board packs going out a couple of hours before a meeting. And that just doesn't give directors time to read the board pack or formulate questions at all. And if people really want those external voices to be heard in the boardroom and to optimise the decision-making capabilities and mitigate risks and spot mistakes, which is what they are there to do, then we need to allow them time to collect their thoughts. We're all aiming in our meetings for a healthy amount of questioning and debate, and the best way to do that is to have engaged directors, and it's great to see challenge and debate in those meetings, and we can then capitalise on the combined skills and experience of everyone in the room. And the company secretary can help with that debate by ensuring that the chairman focuses on discussions and debates in the meeting and not a regurgitation or a rereading of the papers in the meeting to everybody, or the presenter putting the slides up and then reading through the slides back to the board. It doesn't help anybody, and it's really important to remember that the board's time is precious and it's short, and it needs to be utilised to the best of its ability. So moving on to drafting minutes then. So board minutes should, as we all know, include the actions considered by the board, the motions that were made, and whether or not these motions were approved. Personal observations and quotes, they don't belong in the minutes, they shouldn't be in there. But noteworthy events like late arrivals, early departures, and any dissent should definitely be noted.
Yeah, very rightly said, Erika. I think this is an important tip to take away from today's session. Company secretaries, I think, often face challenges in situations where directors are either too chatty, sometimes they make personal comments, and at times they deviate from the agenda topic. Have you ever faced any such situation in real life? And I think most of the company secretaries, they struggle with the situation. And so yeah, like how did you manage in case if you have been into such situation? Sorry, I think it's our IT team. Could you please put yourself on mute? Yeah, I think it's better now. So sorry, where were we? Yeah, so I was talking about like, have you ever faced any such situation where directors they're either too chatty or they make some personal comments, or sometimes let's say they deviate from the agenda topic. If yes, how did you manage to maneuver the conversation back to the agenda?
Yes, I've experienced that many times and for many different reasons. So I think this situation, it's important to be professional, but also to be human. So when that happens, I think it's time for the company secretary to start reading the room. I think it's for the chair to lead on getting the meeting back on track, but you should already have agreed with the chair the role that you play in this. Some chairs like you to stare at them, which obviously doesn't work in the virtual world that we're now in. Some of them like you to pass them notes, which again doesn't work in the virtual world, but you can obviously message them through video conferencing platforms. You can use messaging on your mobiles to text them, WhatsApp them. There's various different ways of being able to do that. The other option is that they will be happy for you to just step in and maybe say, well, there's only a couple of minutes left on this agenda, and then they will then take that as their cue to try and wrap up and hurry along everybody in the conversation. So that's a helpful tip. You can also, by adding the timings to the agenda, that allows people to do their own clock watching and work out when they should be moving away from a particular topic. Although it's really important that that isn't the complete decider on a discussion, because there's some really important information that might still need to be discussed, and it's important that we don't just live strictly by the time, we actually make sure that the right decisions are made, and that might mean extending certain agenda items or changing the agenda slightly. So as a company secretary in this sort of situation, it's important to raise the flag and to make sure that you understand as well why the board deviated from the agenda, because it might be something useful for you to know for your next meeting or to add into the next agenda. For example, the directors might not have spoken in a while, and cutting them short actually might be seen as very rude and overly process driven, which is something that we can be known for anyway. So we definitely don't want to be doing that in front of everybody. So it would then do things like, it would prevent them, if you interrupt them, from developing and building those relationships between themselves. And you won't win any friends by cutting those conversations short. That's not to say that they should be talking for excessive periods of time at all off the agenda, but you will need to work out when that conversation can kind of come to a close, and you'll know that from knowing the people in the room, and when it's polite to cut them off. Apologies, I don't know why I'm so demand for the moment, but I am. Excellent. So yes, so I was talking about, apologies. Yes, so I was talking about the company secretary's role, and when we talk then about the positives actually that kind of come out of this, so when the board go off topic, sometimes that can actually be a good thing. And I found that some really good points have been raised during these kind of deviations off the agenda. But you really have to balance this with the irritation that other directors might feel of kind of going off topic. People might start talking about the weekend or how the cricket was, and they have no interest, and actually they have a meeting to get to and they have a tight deadline and they really want things to move on with pace. So it's a fine balance, but it's where our kind of reading the room and that sort of intelligence kind of comes in. So it's important that you look at every situation differently, I think. And perhaps it's an indicator that the board are getting tired. Sometimes I've been in some really tough conversations and the board kind of get to the end of a conversation and something triggers someone to laugh, or someone triggers something to say something about what happened at the weekend, because it's exactly the same type of topic but just different, and you feel the pressure in the room just dissipate and it all goes away, and actually you realize that allowing them a couple of minutes to talk about something when they might be, you know, making some really business critical decisions actually can be really helpful, because it can get quite tense in that environment, especially if people have very different views, which is obviously what you're trying to nurture and allow everyone to have their voice. So just quickly then, going through what needs to be in the agenda, you obviously need to note the attendance, who's there, who isn't, who the visitors are. In shareholders meetings, I would normally produce something like a sign-up sheet so that you can get people to sign in. You need to make sure that you approve the previous minutes. You cover matters arising or old business that needs covering, and then you also include obviously your new discussions or new business discussions that need to take place. And as I mentioned earlier, I think it's important that we at least consider whether the agenda needs to be structured in that traditional way that I've just set out. There are lots of different ways of doing the same thing, and if your board is open to it, you might want to try changing things around a little bit. Sometimes it can be really helpful to dive into the new business. Everybody is really raring to go, and if, I don't know, there's a new business proposition that they know because they've read the papers that's coming up and they really want to talk about it, then sometimes putting the minutes and various other procedural bits before that can mean that they don't spend enough time looking at that because they just want to rush into getting into the juicy parts of the conversation. It's also really useful when you're looking at the matters arising to ensure that they are actually covered, and sometimes covering that at the end of the meeting can be really helpful, because it's very easy before the minutes or after the minutes are discussed to say that will be on the agenda today, don't worry, let's move on. But how many boards actually come back and say, did we actually discuss that in the right level of detail? Are we happy that this action has now been concluded? They just don't. Whereas if you put it at the end of the meeting, then you also have that opportunity to be able to come back and reflect and check that that actually has been addressed. So that can be really helpful.
No, I completely agree. And this really helps us at the time of the meeting that proper actions are noted, and at least they are referred to, even if they are not discussed in detail. So yes, I think it's a very important tip to take away from today's session. Also, Erika, I see minutes a very time-consuming task, especially when some critical articles are being discussed, or let's say there are too many items on the agenda. So it's good to share some tips and some simple ways to make it more efficient.
Yeah, of course. So I use a template for my minutes, and that allows me to type my minutes in real time in the meeting. Now, I'm not administrator or typist or touch typist by training, so don't get me wrong there. I wasn't that quick to start off with, but the first time I did it, I was definitely quite nervous about it. I'd been writing minutes by hand for years. It had worked. It was great. I could go back and see everything, and there was no problem there at all. But I thought, I'm just going to take the bull by the horns. I'm going to do this, and it's either going to work or it's not going to work. So I had my notepad sat beside me. I had 3 pens in case one of them ran out, as I always do. And then sat there and started typing away. Obviously, the chairman was aware that that was what I was going to be doing for the meeting. And it turned out that actually it was really helpful. It was helpful because it saved me time in drafting the minutes, because the majority of the text was already in there, albeit I didn't write, and I still don't write in full sentences. I write some of its notes, some of its kind of thoughts as I go through, the same as I would do if I was writing it by hand. But one thing I find now that I have got much better with my typing is that actually it gives me more time to think, and actually not being able to scribble down something really quickly allows me to listen to a paragraph of conversation and actually summarize it far easier, because I can't verbatim type everything up, and I wouldn't want to, because I don't think that's how minutes should be drafted. So that actually is helpful in a way that I hadn't really expected. So if we move on then to the distribution of minutes, we all know that it's really important that they get distributed to the board as soon as possible. And unless they're approved, they aren't actually any insurance policy at all. They're just words on a page. So the earlier you can circulate those to your board, the better. A quick turnaround is always helpful for the company secretary to make sure that we remember what was actually said in that meeting, but also for the chair and others as well. I think that ideally the minutes should be circulated to the chair within 48 hours if you can. And that's my own personal standard, but I know a lot of other company secretaries adopt that, or longer periods of time to be able to get those minutes drafted. And I think that 48-hour window is really important, because the discussions are still fresh in everyone's mind, and therefore you can rely on your memory a little bit more than you can a week or so on when you're not quite sure anymore. And I think that time frame is sometimes shortened if there's a really business critical decision taking place. We've had a couple actually beyond governance this week where there have been transactions that were either moving ahead or they weren't moving ahead, and that information was then fed back to the people that we were dealing with in relation to that transaction. And I needed to make sure for my own sanity that those minutes were drafted and approved by the chairman, to make sure that those people that were then relying on the discussions that took place in that meeting were actually documented in the way they were supposed to be. Because it's quite common, I found, for CEOs and chairmen to be sat in the same meeting together, but when you step outside of that meeting, they forget or misconstrue certain parts of the conversation, and they think that meant they could do ABC, whereas that was never the intention of the board. And having the minutes to be able to point to before those decisions are taken is really, really important. It puts everybody's mind at rest, in particular yours, because if the CEO has then gone off and done something that he maybe wasn't discussed or approved in the meeting, then you have your set of board minutes which may not quite correlate, and then he's acting outside of his powers, which is never a good place to be in. So yeah, the 48 hours is helpful, but obviously it could be slightly smaller than that. I've been working into the small hours after a board meeting, typing up minutes so that they could be ready on the director's desk the following morning, because we had another subsequent board meeting that followed on from that. And I think it's really important that we get things documented as quickly as we can, so that everyone knows where they're at. So with regards to COVID-19, I think, Soumya, I think I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, but I think, COVID-19 is something that we all want to hear upon. We are clearly living in a new era where physical meetings has now switched to virtual meetings. Well, thanks to the technology and meeting apps that has made this convenient for all of us. But I'm sure this has been challenging for most of the company secretaries to adapt the sudden change and in the style of conducting meeting at the same time, sticking to the deadlines. So please could you share your experience so far in organizing virtual board meetings, or if you have organized any AGM recently for a large base of shareholders meetings during this lockdown, and what what tips would you like to give us in organizing such meetings virtually and probably and minutes taking to ensure proper corporate governance?
Yeah. So yeah, in this climate, obviously face-to-face meetings are being replaced with virtual meetings, and there are no exceptions for board and shareholder meetings, as you rightly pointed out. So it can be difficult to minute those meetings. You can't always tell who's talking, especially if they don't have their cameras on, which can be really frustrating. But I think if you're able to type the minutes in, if you're able to type the minutes as you go, then that's really helpful. I've found that typing the minutes and being able to look up, because obviously people can't just see the top of your head otherwise if you're either handwriting or typing your minutes. I think that touch typing has a kind of additional benefit because it allows you to be engaged in the room. So you can be typing away and look down only a number of times, and that can be really helpful. To allow people to feel your presence in the meeting room as an advisor, because you're not just there as an administrator. When it comes to AGMs, Beyond Governance have project managed AGMs for London Stock Exchange FTSE 250 companies in the wake of the COVID pandemic. And I think that the planning is the same when it comes to the face-to-face meetings, but the technology is obviously something that's quite new for most of our clients, and we support them through that. So key considerations for our clients are whether or not you want the meeting to be an open or a closed invitation for the AGM. So for companies I've worked with, they usually want a closed invitation. So the invitation only goes out to those people that are legally entitled to be there or have specifically approached the company and asked if they can attend. The reasons for that type of decision is often that the company is quite high profile, and they want to monitor who's in that audience, and in particular the newspapers and the media and who they are. So in these difficult times, virtual meetings are unfortunately the only option for everybody, but they do bring with them some benefits over the face-to-face meetings. And perhaps in time to come, post-COVID, companies will potentially look at hybrid meetings, so face-to-face and virtual together, because actually they've seen the benefits and they understand how virtual meetings now work. And then the shareholders can benefit from both. Because one thing I've noticed from virtual AGMs that I've attended is that the demographic of the attendees, or the age range and the type of people that attend, is very different. And actually one client we found had a number of additional attendees. There was kind of a swell of numbers of people that attended because they could just dial in from home and just listen in. And I think that virtual AGMs also, with that, have the disadvantage that older investors might not be up to speed with the technology. They might not understand how to get information. And early on in the pandemic, it was definitely an untrodden path as to how you communicate with those shareholders very, very quickly when you realise that you can't hold your AGM face-to-face, and you put things up on your website, which is fine, but that doesn't necessarily, it's not the first place that an older investor would look to find that information, particularly the retail investors, or the people that invest their own personal money. So I think that the company secretary, there's fewer physical logistics when it comes to arranging the virtual AGMs. You don't have to worry about copies of notices, goodie bags, food and drink. You don't have to worry about things like security. I've been at AGMs where there've been activist shareholders, and you don't have to worry about that. And the list goes on. There's lots of things that you won't have to worry about. But the one thing that you do have to think about is the technology, and that could well be a really big failure if you're unable to action that and make it work, because that obviously reflects on the reputation of the company as to how well that runs. So with the technology, you obviously have less disruptions because you can remove people from your meeting very easily without physically having to have someone remove them. And you can also mute someone if they're becoming disruptive. And so that can be really helpful. But it's important that you choose the right person to be in charge of that functionality, because those people, it's not just a matter of getting rid of them if they're disruptive. They have rights to be there. And it's important that whoever's in charge of that isn't necessarily just the IT people, because they might not know that they can ask questions and they might sound aggressive, but actually they're allowed to be there. And if the chairman is happy to take that question, then they should be allowed to speak, and they shouldn't necessarily be instantly kicked out of the meeting because of something that feels like it might escalate into something bigger. I think that one of the AGMs that we ran recently, we had the opportunity within the technology to run live Q&A sessions, which I think was really important for the shareholders. I think that they want to know that their voice is being heard. And as much as questions sent in advance and answers to questions can be helpful, it doesn't necessarily get over the fact that they want to ask those spontaneous questions based on the presentation that they haven't yet seen. So when they see that presentation, they might have lots of questions that they want to ask, and being able to facilitate that, I think, is really important. And that allows you to bring that kind of good governance along with you to the virtual board meetings and likewise AGMs that we're having at this moment in time.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I believe we have covered all the topics for today. And yeah, so like in conclusion, like, do you have any closing remarks, Erika?
Yeah, okay. So in conclusion, I think that whilst board meeting minutes may not be rocket science, they are far from trivial. I think they're essential for board meeting success, and if they're drafted correctly, they can be the board's best insurance policy. I think that there are many reasons why minutes are important, and these are listed again on the slide that I've just put up. But I think the three most important ones for me are the ones that have the most power. And I think these are the facts that minutes protect the board by demonstrating that they discharge their directors' duties. They make decisions watertight, which means that if things go wrong and legal proceedings are brought by internal or external parties, you know that you can rely on them. And also they are evidence of what actually happened, both from a legal perspective, but also for those future board members and for the company secretaries of the future to look back at historic thinking and potentially think about what did and didn't work in the past and why that might be. And I think at the end of the day, whatever the approved minutes say obviously happened, that it's a legal document, it obviously happened. And there you have your insurance policy. But for those missing details that you or your directors might have wished were included but weren't, you might just have exposed your organisation to one of its greatest risks.
Yeah. Thank you, Erika, for sharing this insightful information with us today. And probably now we could move on to our question and answers round. I can see some questions coming up, and here we have a very interesting question. Yeah, and it's a very practical one too. So, Erika, this one is for you. And like, have you ever had to deal with any such situation where boardroom is filled with a tense environment? Chairman is probably unprepared, maybe because of late circulation of board packs, or unable to address the question from other directors, which could be independent directors or nominee directors. As a company secretary, what strategy would you adopt or advise the chairman?
Yeah, that's a good one. And, I would like to think that none of the chairs that I have would be unprepared as far as the agenda goes. because we have pre-meetings to run through what's on the agenda and what will be discussed. But I have been in meetings where the chair is distracted, maybe by personal matters that happen outside the board meeting, and they've asked me to take a more leading role on the agenda. And I think in that situation, it's important to not necessarily take the role away from the chair, because after all, they are still in the meeting and they're just asking for support, not for you to take over. But likewise, they've raised the flag that they need help. So I think it's important that you give that. And I think that depending on how difficult the situation is, whether the chair has actually just handed over to you or whether they've just asked for some help or what's the next point on the agenda or something like that, then I think you can take the lead on calling speakers into the room, allowing the board to kind of move through the agenda as the chair would have done. I think it's important to always be respectful of the chair and changes that he or she might have during the meeting, because all of a sudden they may just have finished, I don't know, messaging some very important person, and all of a sudden they're back in the meeting and hang on now, I want to be chair again. We don't need the company secretary to hold that post. So it's important that if they want to step back in or interject, that you allow them to do that. And I think that it will also be helpful for you to be able to navigate the papers with them, and to ensure that all the board actions are covered, because sometimes that isn't at the top of the agenda for the chairman, but it's obviously very important that it happens for the minutes. And to your other question about what I would do if someone raised a question, maybe a board member kind of asked a question that wasn't answered or misinterpreted or ignored, then I would flag that to the chair. And again, it's important to discuss how this should be resolved before the meeting with the chair, because it's likely that this will come up at some point. And then the chair may say that they want you to speak up and say, oh, hang on a minute, could you please address the question that Mr. or Mrs. so-and-so asked? Or they might want you to be much more discreet and maybe message them or pass them a note of some description to enable them to ask that question themselves. It is totally dependent on the personality of the chairman.
Yeah, that's a helpful tip, Erika. Thank you. And I think it's a very common issue that all company secretaries faces. And okay, so here we have one more question, which is again a very practical one. It says that as a company secretary, have you ever faced the pressure from the chairman or probably top executives to delete some portion in the minutes when it comes to their review? So this portion could have been actually discussed in the meeting, or do you think from governance perspective it is important to retain it? How would you deal with such a situation and advise the chairman? I think this is a beautiful question, and we all, I do face it sometimes, and I'm glad, yeah, it's a common one. So what are your thoughts, Eric, on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. It's almost a rite of passage of people that are writing minutes to have your minutes scrutinised in that sort of a way. So I think when you're dealing with this, it's important to not take those changes and redactions personally. I think our role as company secretary should be much more than just minuting the meetings. We should be providing legal and governance advice too. We're not an administrative function. We are professionals with professional qualifications. So to give an example, in one of the companies that I worked for, the minutes approval process required me to pass the sets of minutes to the CEO and the CFO for amendments and additions before they were sent through to the chair and thereafter the board. And on a number of occasions, the CEO would cut large portions of the minutes that contextualized or put into practice kind of the key discussions. And these were often elements of the discussions that he wished hadn't happened in the meeting, or they were where his ideas had been probed and he felt very exposed by having them in there, as if it was some sort of negativity on him and how well he delivered his presentation. And in this case, the discussion was important and it needed to be included, and it framed the reason for the decision in the end, which obviously is very important when it comes to legal proceedings, to be able to show how you got to the decision, not just that a decision was made. And I think that if the change or the deletion to your minutes makes you feel really uncomfortable, I think it's important to raise that with the chair. And then I think if the chair and the board thereafter support you to take something out, then I think that you just have to accept it. I think it becomes more awkward in situations, as I've found, where you're asked to add additional things into the minutes, information or topics that were just never discussed. And often the board in its entirety can be very supportive of this having taken place in that meeting. And I think when that happens, it's important that you conclude for yourself whether there are more fundamental questions around that organisation that you're in, and whether that organisation is right for you, and whether in fact you're able to add value and do your job well, if in fact the minutes are very much seen as just a document that you just write whatever you like in, whether or not it was discussed in the meeting.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct, Erika. Well, we are approaching to the time that was allotted to us, and we have got like one more question. So let's take this one last question. And this is, can you give us some tips for improving the drafting skills? So,
yeah.
Erika?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting parts of being company secretary is the fact that you don't really get an awful lot of exposure to writing board minutes until you're actually expected to write board minutes, because often there's only one of you in a meeting, and it's when your successor moves on or is unavailable that you're then called in to write those minutes. I think that one really useful tip I found when I was practicing was listening to the news. And what I did was I listened to a news item for maybe 20 minutes and wrote minutes down as they were talking, or an interview on the TV as they were talking. And that allows you to kind of pause and rewind and work out kind of listen to it again after you've read your notes and see how good your summary is. That's a really useful, easy way that anybody can kind of improve their drafting skills.
Well, yeah, I think this is a very innovative and a useful tip, and I'm sure this way, we can improve our drafting skills. So yeah, thank you. This was a really good tip. I think we have nearly come to our time for today now. And thank you, Erika. I really appreciate your inputs today. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope you found our webinar interesting and insightful. Should you have any queries relating to the topic or otherwise, please send us an email at ukcenter@icsi.edu. This email is also there on ICSI website. So thank you once again and stay safe. Thank you.